a man who authorities say sexually assaulted and killed a 20-year-old woman 3 decades ago, has been identified. The Wichita Police Department named Paul Hart, who died in a traffic collision in 1999, a suspect in the 1989 death of Krista Martin. On October 2, 1989, tragedy struck when Krista Martin was discovered deceased in a residence in the 500 block of South Osage. Although DNA evidence was collected at the time of the incident, testing was not available. It was, nonetheless, carefully preserved. Investigators were unable to identify a suspect at the time, despite conducting numerous interviews. But they continued to scrutinize the evidence, gather leads over the years, and collect DNA from multiple individuals for comparison with the evidence from the scene. Yet no match was found, according to police. The case detective sent evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation between 1990 and 1992 in hopes of identifying a suspect. But the effort yielded no results, and the case was left unsolved. Although another attempt in 2009 to identify a suspect through the DNA evidence proved unsuccessful, the police department tried again in 2020. In 2020, the Wichita Police Department, leveraging advanced technology again, sought the assistance of the FBI to re-evaluate the DNA evidence collected in 1989. After homicide detectives and federal authorities continued with their investigation through 2021 and 2022, they collaborated with private industry genealogists to scrutinize DNA profiles and attempt to identify a suspect. Finally, in April 2023, a possible suspect, Paul Hart, emerged. It was discovered that Hart died in a traffic collision in Memphis, Tennessee, in March of 1999. So law enforcement collected DNA samples from Hart's direct relatives and through additional testing confirmed that Hart was the suspect in the 1989 homicide of Martin. Detective Adam Vandermolen told CNN that while Martin's DNA was recovered from a sexual assault kit that was collected back at the time, police were only able to determine that she died by blunt force trauma, a blow to the side of her head. There was never a murder weapon found that we know of, he said in an interview. We don't know what was used. This was a long road. Police can't say for sure how Hart and Martin might have met, although Vandermolen told CNN that Krista and Paul lived about 6 houses from one another at the time of the murder. Vandermolen added that through talking to Krista's family, Paul's family, his girlfriend at the time, and Krista's writings, we have not been able to find a true connection between them. But some patterns about how Martin lived did emerge, which may point to how spent her final hours. What we did learn was that Krista was a very outgoing individual that frequented local drinking establishments and befriended people she encountered, Vandermolen told CNN. It was not uncommon for Krista to get rides home from people she had recently met and invited them to her apartment. He also said there was no forced entry at her home on the night of her death. When the police presented the facts of the case to Sedgwick County District Attorney Mark Bennett, it was determined that charges would be filed if Mr. Hart were still alive. As he is deceased, this case is now considered cleared. Michelle Wyatt from California was the type of young woman everyone wants as a friend. The athletic student was 20 in 1980 and enjoyed scuba diving and tap dancing, and she was trying to decide whether to pursue a career in oceanography or telecommunications. However, she also worked as a Safeway cashier to pay her way through her studies and taught kids how to dance and play musical instruments. It's coming up on 41 years since neighbors in Michelle Wyatt's condo in the San Diego County town of Santee heard screams, and since her roommate came home the next day and made a horrifying discovery. The 20-year-old college student was dead. She'd been raped and strangled. For 4 decades, the deadly attack confounded every investigator who picked up the file. Years later, DNA seemed like it could help. But time and again, it didn't. Until one day in 2021 when that changed. Investigative genetic genealogy finally identified Michelle's killer as a former neighbor named John Patrick Hogan. But there was no arrest, no trial, and no conviction because Hogan had died 17 years earlier, ironically on the very same day of the year, October 9th. Brian Patterson, who just retired after more than 26 years with the Sheriff's Department, the last 11 in homicide, led the team of detectives that solved the case. It had been a cold case for years. During the initial investigation, 38 suspects had been interrogated and ultimately cleared, many years later when their DNA was found not to match the killer's, which had been found in Wyatt's body. The case had been assigned to another detective, Patterson said, who had had no luck. Then, little over 2 years ago, Patterson was asked by a deputy district attorney with whom he was working on another case if he'd like to take another look. After reading up on the case, he agreed to take it on. "Both I and the DA grew up in Santee," Patterson said. "So I just took an interest in it, and when I read through the case, there were people in there I knew. So it was just kind of interesting. And everything had been done for the most part. They had eliminated nearly 40 people through DNA, and the main people they thought had done it were eliminated through DNA. So there wasn't a whole lot to do on it. But then when genetic genealogy came about, that kind of opened the door. Michelle Wyatt and Patrick Hogan's paths crossed on the night of October 9th, 1980, just a few days after Hogan had gotten back into San Diego from New Mexico. In January 1980, Wyatt's father had let her and a roommate move into a condo he owned at 10586 Kerrigan Court in Santee. Michelle was ecstatic, as much as she loved her dad, her mom, and her little brother, Ray J. She was excited to be on her own. Patterson, Hogan's connection to Michelle, we think. Is that because he had lived in that complex? He knew people in that complex. He knew a guy who lived cater corner from Michelle, and that guy used to play pool with her in her garage because she had a pool table. So when I spoke to him, he goes, "Yeah, I know her and we saw her, and I wanted to date her. But I was kind of scared because she's an attractive lady." And then I brought up Patrick Hogan, and he's talking. And then all of a sudden it hits him why I brought up his name. And he goes, "Oh, are you telling me he did it?" I told him it looks like he might have. And he says, "Well, of all the people I know, that's the guy who could do something like that." But nobody ever asked about him. On the evening of Wednesday, October 8th, Michelle left the Sue Hamilton School of Dance on El Cajon Boulevard, where she had been taking tap dancing lessons 3 nights a week since she was 7, and drove home. There she was met by her boyfriend of 4 months, Patrick Acombe, who had just completed his last class of the day at Mesa College. The two had met the previous spring at the Safeway store where Michelle was working as a cashier. Acombe, who at the time lived nearby, had started paying her regular visits before finally asking her out for a date in July. They began seeing each other regularly and grew quite close. Just a few days before she was murdered, when her mother half-jokingly asked, "Hey, Michelle, are you getting married?" Michelle rolled her eyes and, giggling, said, "Oh, Mom, you're embarrassing me, but yes, I finally found the right one." Shortly after Acombe's arrival, he and Michelle retreated to the condo's garage, where they played 3 games of pool while talking about what each had done that day. Michelle had attended only 2 of her classes that morning, opting, instead of attending a 3rd, to go running with her boyfriend before dance class, and she was fatigued. Still, she managed to beat Acombe in all 3 pool games, and on their way out of the garage, she kidded him about her victories. After turning out the garage lights, they went back inside the condo through the sliding glass doors in the dining room and sat down in the living room to watch television. Acombe doesn't recall whether they had locked the glass doors after their entry, and the question has repeatedly bothered him since. What he does remember clearly is that he left through the front door shortly before 1 the following morning, instructing Michelle, as he always did, to lock the door behind him. That was the last time anyone saw Michelle Wyatt alive. Less than an hour later, a neighbor reported hearing Michelle's 2 collies barking furiously, accompanied by some yelling, but they didn't investigate. Just before 5 the next afternoon, Michelle's roommate, who asked her name not be used, returned home from an overnight excursion and parked her car along the Kerrigan Court curb. She had moved in with Michelle the previous July. The glare of the late afternoon sun was blinding to the roommate as she walked past the 2 rows of condos onto the strip of grass leading to her own front door. As she approached the condo, what she saw filled her with instant apprehension. I knew something had to be wrong because the lights were still on and the curtains were drawn, the roommate recalled later. Michelle always got up early, and she would never leave the house shut up like that. As I walked up to the front door, I remember thinking, this is weird, because the mail was still in the mailbox and the newspaper was on the ground outside the door. Then I opened the door and I saw her right away, and I knew immediately. I don't know how, I just knew. Instinct, maybe. You just know. I dropped everything I had in my hands. I dropped the newspaper, the mail, some books I had borrowed from a friend, and ran to a neighbor's apartment across the lawn, all the while thinking I must be dreaming. I called the police and then Mrs. Wyatt. I waited for the police outside the front door of the apartment I had run to. I wasn't sure this had really happened, and I figured the police would tell me if it was true, if Michelle was really dead. When they told me, I just couldn't believe it. All I could say over and over was, "Oh my God, oh my God." When police arrived at the Santee condominium in response to the roommate's phone call, they found Wyatt's lifeless body just inside the front door. Her purse and its contents had been dumped out into the toilet. They collected evidence, dusted for fingerprints, and took lots of photos. The body was taken to the San Diego County Medical Examiner's office, where an autopsy determined that Wyatt had died of asphyxiation after having been strangled with a telephone cord. She had also been sexually assaulted, and seminal fluid was recovered, according to the news release. After the murder, Hogan returned to New Mexico. Very little is known of his later life, except that he got divorced, married a second time, had a second child, and died of a methamphetamine overdose on October 9, 2004, 24 years to the day after he murdered Wyatt. At the time of his death, he was 42. The detective thinks this is what happened on that fateful night of October 9, 1980, when John Patrick Hogan murdered Michelle Wyatt. Well, there was no forced entry, so one of 2 things, he says. She recognized him banging on the door. She looked and said, "Oh, I know this guy." Not a big deal. Maybe he needed something. Maybe he was asking for something. She lets him in. Or her boyfriend had just left, and she thought he was coming back, so she opened the door. Maybe he was watching. Maybe he watched the boyfriend leave. Who knows? And then she maybe thought that was the boyfriend coming right back and just opened the door, not thinking because people said she wouldn't have opened that door for a stranger at 12:30, 12:45 at night. The assault happened right there, probably in the living room. I don't think it went anywhere else. And then everything he used to kill her was right there. Patterson says all of Hogan's relatives are resigned to the fact that he killed Wyatt, except for his first wife, the high school sweetheart and mother of his oldest daughter. She suggested the 2 had consensual sex, and then he left and someone else killed her. Patterson considers such a scenario highly unlikely. She's, really grasping. She doesn't want to admit that her high school sweetheart was a killer. Wyatt's parents are grateful for the detectives who kept the investigation going over 40 years. "I wish there is something I could do for them," Louise Wyatt said. "A hug and a thank you doesn't seem like enough." A California tech company executive has been charged in the 1992 murder of his former roommate's girlfriend. John Kevin Woodward, the president and CEO of ReadyTech, was charged with the murder of Laurie Houts, a 25-year-old computer engineer who was found strangled in her car in Mountain View, the Santa Clara County office of the district attorney stated. Woodward, now 58, was arrested in July 2022 at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York after arriving from Amsterdam. Officials said Houts was discovered dead in her vehicle near a garbage dump about a mile from her work. The rope used to kill her was still around her neck, and her footprints were visible on the interior of the car's windshield, a sign of her struggle with the suspect. Her pocketbook was found nearby, undisturbed. Woodward, who was roommates with Houts' boyfriend, was arrested later that same year in connection with the homicide. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office said Woodward was openly jealous of Houts and had developed an unrequited romantic attachment to his roommate, and had no alibi for the night Houts was killed. When the boyfriend asked Woodward if he killed her as police listened in, Woodward asked what the investigators knew. Although Woodward's fingerprints were located on the outside of Houts' car, investigators in 1992 were never able to show he was inside the vehicle. He was tried twice for the crime. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, and a second trial, roughly a year later, also resulted in a hung jury. In the second trial, the trial judge noted that new evidence would need to be brought forward to retry Woodward again. Woodward relocated after the second trial to the Netherlands, where he currently resides. Thanks to updates in DNA technology, police were able to connect Woodward to the rope used in the crime with additional evidence. Beginning in late 2020, detectives started to re-examine the Houts case, resubmitting items from the investigation to the Santa Clara County Crime Lab for renewed analysis. Police said DNA samples collected from evidence at the scene came back matching Woodward's DNA. Additionally, over 80 latent fingerprints that were also collected at the time of Laurie's death were re-examined by the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Identification Unit, which resulted in even more fingerprints matching Woodward. The new information, along with evidence that led to Woodward being charged and tried as the primary suspect during the original investigation, led the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office to issue a new warrant for Woodward's arrest for murder. This case is the culmination of incredible determination by our detectives over the decades and with phenomenal teamwork with our agency partners here in Santa Clara County and in New York, said Mountain View Police Chief Chris Young in a statement. I am honored that our agency finally gets to give hope to Laurie's family that they can see a successful prosecution carried out. It bears repeating, we do not give up on justice for victims, no matter what. Woodward is being held in New York without bail until he can be extradited back to California. He faces life in prison if convicted. District Attorney Jeff Rosen praised the cooperation and assistance from the U.S. Department of Justice and the Dutch Ministry of Justice and Security. Dutch authorities coordinated with the DOJ, obtaining a warrant for the search of Woodward's home and business in the Netherlands in less than 24 hours, seizing multiple computers and USB drives, he said. A 76-year-old serial killer serving life for murdering nearly a half-dozen women and girls in New Jersey and New York since the 1960s, admitted in 2022 he strangled a woman in a Nassau County Mall parking lot more than 50 years ago and confessed to 4 other slayings. Cusick was a 23-year-old dance teacher and mother of 1. Her parents reported her missing when she failed to return, and her father was the one to find Cusick beaten, raped, and duct-taped in the back seat of her car in the mall parking lot, just 2 days after Valentine's Day that year. Richard Cottingham, 73, the so-called torso killer or Times Square killer, who claims to have murdered up to 100 people in New York and New Jersey, pleaded guilty in 2022 to the 1968 killing of Long Island single mother Diane Cusick, and also confessed to 4 previously unsolved slayings from the 1970s. Those include the May 1972 and July 1972 killings of Mary Beth Hines and Laverne Moy, as well as the 1970s murders of Sela Hyman and Marita Rosado Neves. He won't be prosecuted additionally for those cases, but will have another 25-year sentence added to his current life sentence as part of the plea deal. Richard is already serving a life sentence in New Jersey State Prison for murdering nearly a dozen women and girls in the 1960s. He allegedly often posed as a mall security guard and approached victims in parking lots, accusing them of shoplifting before launching his violent attacks. As part of a plea deal, Cottingham received immunity from prosecution for the 4 other killings. Cottingham, a former Manhattan computer programmer and father of 3, has claimed he was responsible for up to 100 homicides, though authorities in New York and New Jersey have officially linked him to only a dozen so far. He has been imprisoned since 1980 when he was arrested after a motel maid heard a woman screaming inside his room. Authorities found the woman alive but handcuffed and suffering from bite marks and knife wounds. Police believe Cottingham, while pretending to be an officer, accused her of stealing and then overpowered the 98-pound woman. The medical examiner concluded that Cusick had been beaten in the face and head and was suffocated. She had defensive wounds on her hands, and police were able to collect DNA evidence at the scene. At the time, however, DNA testing did not exist. It was only through advances in DNA technology that the NCDA and our partners at the Nassau County Police Department could solve this 54-year-old cold case and identify a suspect in Mrs. Cusick's tragic death. Nassau County District Attorney Ann Donnelly said in June 2022, announcing the indictment, "We make a promise to her surviving daughter today. We will bring her mother's killer to justice." Cusick's daughter, Darlene Altman, stated, "I never thought I would see this day. But all these people got justice for my mom. It was overwhelming to see him on video in court with a dead stare." He was convicted in the early 80s of murdering 5 women, 3 in New York and 2 in Bergen County, New Jersey. In 2010, he allegedly confessed to the slaying of another woman in northern New Jersey in 1967. In 2021, Cottingham pleaded guilty to the 1974 murders of 2 New Jersey teens, 17-year-old Mary Ann Pryor and 16-year-old Lorraine Marie Kelly, friends who had gone to the mall for new bathing suits but never returned. 5 days after going missing, their bodies were found nude and beaten in the woods in northern New Jersey. He was dubbed the torso killer because he allegedly dismembered victims in some cases. In one December 1979 case, he decapitated and cut off the hands of 2 women, believed to be sex workers, in a Times Square hotel before setting the hotel room on fire. After more than 13 years of piecing together a DNA trail, investigators followed it to Virginia and arrested a man they allege shot 2 women to death at their home in Mount Union. Christine McWhorter, 22, and her aunt, Beatrice Daniels, 31, died sometime between roughly 6 p.m. January 2nd and 11:50 a.m. January 3rd, 2009, in their apartment at the Chestnut Terrace housing complex. State police investigators say the women were both shot in the head. Mrs. McWhorter's 4-month-old daughter and 4-year-old son were then left behind in the apartment. Neighbors discovered the women had been killed after making contact with Miss McWhorter's son the morning of January 3rd. In May 2022, authorities arrested Maurico Tyrone Johnson, 47, of Newport News, Virginia, and charged him with 2 counts of criminal homicide. The murder was already a cold case when Smith took office by appointment in January 2014 as his predecessor, George Zanuck, moved onto the bench as Huntingdon County's president judge. The case was still cold when Smith was elected to the DA post during the 2015 election cycle. Smith explained work on the case has never ceased. "We continue to work cold cases," Smith said, adding Pennsylvania State Police dedicates a cold case unit to victims like Mrs. McWhorter and Mrs. Daniels for whom justice requires patience. The DA credits the commitment of law enforcement and ongoing advancements in technology with leading to Johnson's arrest, Smith stated. "We're very satisfied and very thankful for the determination of the investigators. And this technology and science has gotten better and better." Smith explained the DNA trail that led to Johnson didn't emerge overnight. Instead, each step investigators made toward Johnson as the alleged killer was a scientific stride. According to the criminal complaint filed by Trooper Jonathan Thomas, droplets of blood were taken into evidence from the scene January 3, 2009, and the initial DNA report concluded blood collected from the stairs and interior doors of the apartment were all deposited by an unidentified male. Fast forward to March 14, 2016, when Trooper David Clemens submitted DNA samples to DNA Solutions, which, in turn, prepared and forwarded the samples to Parabon Nanolabs based in Reston, Virginia. The Parabon Lab issued a snapshot report May 6, 2016, indicating the DNA belonged to an black male with brown to black hair, medium to light brown complexion, and green or hazel eyes. On July 12, 2018, Trooper Dana Martini contacted Tom Shaw, a certified forensic artist and snapshot case manager with Parabon Nanolabs, and asked him to conduct a genetic genealogy analysis of the DNA recovered the murder scene. 3 months later, October 9, 2018, Parabon provided a report on the genetic genealogy of the DNA and identified Mariko Johnson as a potential match. Johnson's appearance is consistent with the snapshot report. Smith declined to comment on how the various parties in the case are linked, but indicated Johnson was acquainted with Mrs. McWhorter through his then-girlfriend, Cynthia Swan. Troopers Thomas and Martini interviewed Johnson for the first time December 12, 2019, at his home in Newport News. According to the troopers, Johnson said he used to travel to Mount Union to visit Swan, whom he dated from 2001 until 2012. He described Mrs. McWhorter as Swan's best friend and denied setting foot in Mrs. McWhorter's apartment. Johnson provided the troopers with a DNA sample via a swab of his mouth. The sample was sent off for analysis by the State Police Lab in Harrisburg December 16, 2019, and on January 3, 2020, the lab reported Johnson's DNA matched blood evidence found on the stairs and interior doors of the crime scene. Investigators then compared Johnson's time card to the estimated time of the double murder. On January 22, 2020, state police received time cards from Johnson's then-employee, the New York Department of Corrections, which confirmed he was off work January 2, 2009, and started his January 3rd shift at 7 a.m. State police estimate the time it takes to travel the 294 miles between Mount Union and Johnson's then workplace is 4 hours and 43 minutes. Police checked to see if Johnson had access to a .25 caliber firearm, the type used to kill Mrs. McWhorter and Mrs. Daniels. On January 23, 2020, troopers Thomas and Martini interviewed the suspect's half-brother, Carol Broadus Johnson of Connecticut, who told the officers he thought his late father owned a .25 caliber handgun and that Mariko Johnson inherited their father's belongings when he passed away in 1998. Thomas and Martini interviewed Swan, Johnson's ex-girlfriend, February 21, 2020, and learned from Swan that she was originally supposed to travel with Miss McWhorter from Philadelphia to Mount Union January 1, 2009, and stay for the weekend, but decided at the last minute to remain in Philadelphia with a man, Benjamin June. Swan told the troopers it was around this time Johnson found out Swan was having an affair with June. Police say the last incoming text on Mrs. McWhorter's cell phone was from Swan, asking McWhorter to call her, It's important. Police say McWhorter did not respond to Swan's text. On July 28, 2020, Thomas and Martini spoke with Robert Spade, the father of Mrs. McWhorter's oldest child. Spade told the troopers he visited Mrs. McWhorter, Mrs. Daniels, and the children the evening of January 2, 2009. Spade reported the woman kept the apartment very clean, and that he didn't observe blood-like drops anywhere in the apartment, and that it was unlike Mrs. McWhorter and Miss Daniels to leave a spill or mess. The arrest warrant for Johnson was issued in May 2022 through Magisterial District Justice Lisa Covert's office. He was taken into custody by Newport News Police. Smith praised current and retired members of the Pennsylvania State Police for their steadfast diligence in investigating this matter. Smith also commended the Newport News Police Department, especially the department's Major Crimes Unit, Homicide Unit, and Fugitive Task Force for their assistance placing Johnson into custody. Brenda Bolton was 23 when she met the man who would become her husband at a young farmers' event in Worcestershire. Both from rural communities, they connected straight away. She was kind, unassuming, and good company. David Venables would later tell the jury on his murder trial. After that first meeting at Droitwich Winter Gardens, Mr. Venables juggled his time seeing her at her home in the tiny village of Rushock, with work on his family's pig farm. He would stop in for breakfast on the way home from dawn trips taking produce from the farm to Birmingham wholesale market. They married in June 1960, before a honeymoon in Jersey, and later moved in together at Quaking House Farm in Kempsey. Mr. Venables' father had given him the land to build their marital home, which the couple moved into a year later. There, Mr. Venables farmed pigs, and the pair enjoyed a magnificent view of the surrounding countryside. To outsiders, their life seemed simple yet idyllic. But on May 3, 1982, Brenda Venables vanished. Mr. Venables reported it to police the following day. The previous day, he said, had been perfectly normal, with them sowing potatoes. His wife had also seemed to be enjoying playing with the puppy on the hearthrug, and he noticed nothing unusual in her mood that evening, or after they went to bed. "I just woke up to find she had gone," he told a journalist from the Worcester Evening News. "She has never done anything like this before, and I haven't the faintest idea what has happened to her." He said he had been unable to sleep since she went missing, adding that his wife had been suffering from depression as a result of a recent bout of flu. The village of Kempsey was soon overrun as the search for Mrs. Venables got underway. West Mercia police used a helicopter to aid with the search, and tracker dogs checked farm buildings and derelict properties. But no trace of her was found. Vicky Jennings, a friend of the couple, later recounted Mr. Venables did not seem overly concerned and didn't appear to be actively searching for his wife. David Harrison, now a councillor on Malvern Hills District Council, ran the Farmers Arms pub on Bestman's Lane in Kempsey at the time. "Everybody was surprised. It is the same with any person that goes missing. It becomes the talk of the village," he said. "There was lots of speculation and lots of things put forward, and lots of rumors. A police search," he said, lasted 2 or 3 weeks, covering a 4 or 5 mile area around Kempsey up to the M50 motorway, including his own 9 acres of land. There was a great deal of police coming around searching everywhere to see if there was anything anywhere that would lead to finding her, he said. They cut back all the growth on the ditches to see if there was anything in the ditches. For almost 40 years, Mrs. Venables' family was left without a single answer about what happened to her. Until July 2019, when human remains were found in a septic tank in the grounds of Quaking House Farm. The new owners of the farm, Mr. Venables, had moved out in 2014, wanted the tank serviced. To the horror of engineer Alastair Pitt, he found a large clump of hair before uncovering a human skull. A pelvis and thigh bones were also recovered, although it was impossible to determine cause of death. Remnants of clothing, including half a pair of knickers, a pair of tights, a bra, remains of some shoes, and a sweater, were also in the tank. At the time of the discovery, a search was ongoing just 7 miles away for estate agent Susie Lampla, who disappeared in London in 1986. A site near Pershore had been identified after new information arose, following a search the previous year of a property in Sutton Coldfield, which once belonged to the mother of prime suspect John Cannon. But police said there was no link between the remains and Miss Lampla. It took more than a year until detectives announced the bones had formally been identified as those of Mrs. Venables, and her husband, who was then 88, was charged with her murder. At his trial, details of his double life were revealed, as prosecutors told how he had been in a long-term, on-off relationship with his mother's carer Lorraine Stiles since around 1967. But even though Mrs. Stiles had died in 2017, a statement she had given to police in 1984, after Mrs. Venables had disappeared, was read to the court. She said the day after he reported his wife missing to police, he had telephoned her. He seemed quite composed and suddenly told me his wife had disappeared the night before, and he was phoning to let me know, before I read it in the paper, her statement said. He called around about 2 weeks later, but didn't mention it. I couldn't understand how he was so calm about the whole episode. Prosecutor Michael Burrows told jurors he wanted Mrs. Venables out of the way. He wanted to resume his long-standing affair with another woman, he said. He knew about the septic tank in its secluded location. It was for him almost the perfect hiding place. And for nearly 40 years, it was the perfect place. And he got away with murder. West Mercia Police Constable Peter Sherrick, who was among the search teams, told the hearing how the septic tank was apparently overlooked during the initial searches. He said, "At the time, it just looked like a pad of concrete, and I didn't pay it any attention." Mr. Burrows had said it was beyond belief that Mrs. Venables took her own life by climbing into the septic tank and somehow shifted the heavy lid and put it back in place above her so that there was no sign of any disturbance. He also said it was preposterous to suppose Mrs. Venables walked out of their house that night and was confronted by someone outside the house. Giving his evidence, Venables told how he regretted his affair. He also claimed he and his wife's relationship remained sexual, and that they continued to share a bed until she vanished. But the court heard evidence from notes made by Mrs. Venables' consultant psychiatrist, who she was seeing for treatment for depression in March 1982, saying the couple had not slept together since 1968 and had not shared a bed for 3 years. In police interviews, Venables even claimed murderer Fred West could have been responsible for killing his spouse. But jurors rejected his claims of innocence and convicted him of Mrs. Venables' murder. Following his conviction, the Crown Prosecution Service said few people knew about the very secluded septic tank in 1982, and only 2 people had emptied the tank, Mr. Venables and another worker who said it had been difficult to access. As such, the Crown Prosecution Service added, it was its case that if anybody else had been responsible for Mrs. Venables' death, they would not have known about the tank as a way of concealing her body, and it was unbelievable. She may have been killed somewhere else, and her body returned home. Her family have said her disappearance had devastated them. She was kind and caring and has been greatly missed, they said. We, her surviving family, are thankful that Brenda was found, and that we were able to lay her to rest with her parents in a place of security, calm, and dignity. Marian Walters, who was a friend of Mr. Venables' brother, said the trial puts an end to decades of angst. Melissa Ann Martinez was brutally murdered in West Virginia in 1993. Initially, local law enforcement didn't even know her real name. Nearly 30 years later, police say her killer has finally been found. Martinez, whose maiden name was McWhorter and who also used an alias of Lisa Ann Estep, lived in the 4600 block of Darnell Road near Huntington. On March 16, 1993, officers arrived in response to a shooting at about 4:23 a.m. to an alley in the 1400 block between 4th and 5th Avenues in Huntington, where they found Martinez on a sidewalk. She had been beaten and shot to death. Lacerations were present on her head, and she had been shot once in the torso. The victim was rushed to a nearby hospital where she later succumbed to her injuries. She was shot at least once, in the chest, and suffered severe injuries to her head and face consistent with injuries that would have been caused by a blunt instrument. Her body was taken to the medical examiner's office in South Charleston for an autopsy. Back in Huntington, overlooking the fact that a woman's life was lost, the Huntington community instead turned its focus to complaining about what it perceived to be a rise in violent crime in the city, with media coverage focusing on Martinez being a sex worker. Along with that information, typical for the time, were claims that maybe police weren't doing enough to solve the murder. In any event, the case went cold and the woman's friends publicly mourned her, while her family requested anonymity due to fear of public shame because of her occupation. Her friends reportedly attempted to raise money for a memorial to be placed where she was found. A cross on adjacent utility pole urging action in the case was removed shortly after being put up. The cross read, "Don't let Lisa die in vain." Lisa was like a family member to us. Her friend Ron Tillman told the paper in the aftermath of the tragic loss, "No one has anything to remember her by. We want to try and give her some dignity." Witnesses at the time reported hearing a gunshot. One person said they saw the woman being beaten. Where we go from here depends on where the leads take us, then Huntington Police Department Detective Carl Brooks said in 1993. One of the deceased woman's brothers, speaking anonymously, told the paper that their family was never quite sure why Martinez did sex work, but he went on to describe it as her lifestyle. "I've already prepared my mother in Las Vegas for the fact that the person who murdered Lisa may never be found," her brother told the paper. "After all, most people think she was trash. I hope the police don't think that." The case was shelved. A break only came after Ricky Louis Woody, 59, was arrested in December 2020 on an unrelated charge, a domestic violence complaint about him beating a woman with a bat, shoving her, breaking her phone, and saying he might kill her. A few months later, the defendant, a person of interest in the case from the start, allegedly confessed to the crime that happened in the early 1990s, murder of a woman he knew as Lisa. After some questioning, Woody confessed to the slaying, and the information was relayed to the Huntington Police Department in West Virginia. After Woody's initial confession, Huntington police detectives traveled across the country in September 2021 to the Yellowstone County Detention Facility in Montana, at which time he was officially charged with Martinez's death. A Cabell County grand jury indicted Woody in September 2022, and he was officially charged with murder in October 2022. He is currently being detained in the Yellowstone County Detention Facility. A cold case is finally solved nearly 34 years after a young woman was murdered. The FBI has been working with the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to use new technology to finally bring the family of Stacey Lynn Chahorski some peace. This is a historic case. The FBI said this is the first time in the country when both the victim and the killer have been identified by forensic genealogy. Special Agent Joe Montgomery worked on Stacey's case without knowing her name or identity for nearly a decade. He had an old photo of her in black and white, and all this time, he was trying to fill in the blanks. To me, it's incredible, because as an agent, you live with these cases, he said. Stacey was 19 years old when she went missing. A body was found in December 1988, but law enforcement weren't able to identify it. In 2005, the DNA was entered as a Jane Doe into the missing persons database. In 2015, her murder was assigned to the Cold Case Unit. In March of 2022, Agent Montgomery finally got to call Stacey's family and tell them she had been identified through forensic genealogy nearly 34 years after her death. In August 2022, her killer was identified the same way. I spoke to Stacey's mother last week to let her know who the killer was, and she, of course, got really upset, he said. Law enforcement identified the killer as Henry Frederick Wise, who went by Haas and drove a truck all over the Southeast. He also worked as a stunt driver in South Carolina. He was killed in a stunt accident at Myrtle Beach Speedway in 1999 and burned to death, Montgomery said. Wise died before he could face justice for killing Stacey. He died 23 years before Stacey was ever identified. It was traced back. Wise had a living relative who was interviewed, cooperated, and it was matched to Wise, FBI special agent in charge. Kiri Farley said, "Forensic genealogy uses the DNA from the suspect, or the victim's living relatives, but Agent Montgomery said it takes investigators to make the connections. It's like another lead to run down. It develops a profile, but then you have to go through different relatives, and it's almost like a tree. And you're working your way back to the trunk," Agent Montgomery said. In this case, he said the limbs of that tree lead back to Henry Haas Wise and Stacey Chahorski. They created this photograph. It just sits and sits and sits. And then when something comes through, it's like, wow. It's just really overwhelming. DNA from coffee cup solves 1975 cold case murder of 19-year-old Lindy Sue Biechler. In July 2022, one of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases was solved when David Sinopoli, 68, was arrested for the brutal murder of Lindy Sue Biechler. Lindy was only 19 years old when she was found stabbed to death in her apartment home in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on December 5, 1975. She had been sexually assaulted before being stabbed 19 times in her chest, back, and neck. The young girl also had defensive wounds, showing she fought hard for her life. The knife was still in her neck when she was found. Police worked diligently on the case. They interviewed as many as 300 people, consulted crime experts, and launched a task force. However, the crime went unsolved for nearly 5 decades. On July 18, 2022, Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams announced that a suspect had finally been arrested for Biechler's brutal murder. David Vincent Sinopoli, 68, of East Hempfield Township, Pennsylvania, was charged with criminal homicide. "We are here today due to advances in DNA technology," said Adams. The cold case one was the oldest unsolved ones in the county, and after all those years, a discarded coffee cup helped lead to the arrest. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, genetic genealogist Cece Moore of Parabon Nanolabs determined that Biechler's murderer likely had ancestors from Gasparina, a small town in Italy. Moore then cross-referenced that data with family trees from Lancaster County, and this led her to Sinopoli, who was still living in the same county. Once Sinopoli was on the investigators' radar, authorities started surveilling him for months. When they spotted Sinopoli tossing out a coffee cup at the Philadelphia International Airport, they retrieved it for DNA testing. His DNA was then tested, and it matched the DNA that was found in the victim's underwear. Sinopoli had lived in the same 4-unit building as Lindy. No other known connection between Lindy and the alleged killer has been reported. Sinopoli was arrested at 7 a.m. on July 17, 2022, at his Pennsylvania home. He is now in custody and is being held without bail at Lancaster County Prison. Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 when her life was brutally taken away from her 46 years ago in the sanctity of her own home. The arrest of David Sinopoli marks the beginning of the court process. and we hope that it brings some sense of relief to the victims' loved ones and to the community, who for the past 47 years have had no answers. In 1992, authorities found 29-year-old Nona Stamey Cobb strangled to death and left on the side of the highway. Cobb was last seen on the night of July 6, 1992, at the Welcome Center on Interstate 85 in Cleveland County, where she got into a truck being driven by an unidentified male. Her body was discovered at approximately 6:15 a.m. on the morning of July 7th, discarded on the northbound side of Interstate 77 in Surry County. Investigators reportedly came up with their first suspect approximately 3 years later, when deputies with the Surry County Sheriff's Office questioned Ashboro trucker Sean Patrick Gobble in connection with the case. While Gobble reportedly denied having any involvement in Cobb's death, he was later convicted of murdering 3 other women and was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 14 years in prison. However, DNA obtained from semen found on Cobb's body was analyzed in July 1995 and reportedly ruled Gobble out a suspect in her slaying, leaving investigators without a person of interest in the case for decades. In April 2021, special agents with the SBI's Cold Case Investigation Unit and investigators with the Sheriff's Office re-examined the physical evidence collected from the crime scene, including the DNA found on Cobb's body. Investigators were able to identify Alexander as a possible suspect by matching his DNA profile to the DNA left on Cobb's body. Officers with the Diamond Head Police Department in Mississippi arrested Alexander in May 2022. Online jail records show. He is currently being held in the Hancock County Jail as he awaits extradition back to North Carolina to face the murder charge. Cobb's sister, Vicki Gregory, in 1992, reportedly told the Journal that Cobb had been struggling with a drug problem at the time of her death, but loved her family, especially her then 3-year-old son, Josh. She loved us, and we loved her. Just because you do something wrong doesn't mean you stop loving her, Gregory reportedly said in 1992. She loved Josh. She was very proud of him. Cobb, a widow, had reportedly lost custody of her son approximately 7 months before her death. The boy was reportedly staying with Gregory, who noted that Cobb called to ask about the boy nearly every day. The SBI emphasized that the investigation into Alexander remains ongoing and authorities are looking into the possibility that there may be more victims. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.